Hey, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about competitive landscape. All right, so we're going to talk about competition, but more, right? So when we're looking at things in terms of competition, there's other things to consider, right? There's other forces. So we're going to talk about the five forces framework that Michael Porter made popular several decades ago. And it's taught widely in business classes and business schools. So if you've ever taken a business class, whether it's in university or an online class, you've probably come across this before. If you haven't, then I'll break it down for you. There's five forces, right? Competitors, substitutes, buyer power, supplier power, and new entrants. So what does that mean? Obviously, we know what competitors are, or we should. It's people that compete directly with our products. So again, for Figma, we've gone over several: Adobe XD, InVision, Sketch. There's newer players like ProtoPie and many others that are coming on the scene. So it's becoming a very crowded market. But Figma definitely is growing in popularity, which um, we'll show you that here pretty soon. So I have some cool stuff to show you actually. So um, when we look at in terms of competitors, we have to understand who's competing directly with us. This is a direct competition. Substitutes are a little bit different. So I talked before in the previous video about Microsoft's PowerPoint or Google Slides. Right? You can create designs on screens just like you can in Figma or Sketch or what have you in those other products, but those other products aren't built for designers, right? They're built for presentation. Okay, they're not specifically trying to be built for interface design, I should say. But people still use them for that, right? If they already have a Google or a Gmail account, if they already have an Office subscription or license, why pay for something else or why use another product? It might be one of their reasonings for still using that, right? Or like me, I just wasn't aware of these other design specific products when I first started doing mock-ups and wireframes and storyboards and those kind of things earlier in my career. All right. So substitutes are things that aren't built to solve your problem specifically, but people are using them as a type of workaround, right? Whether it's intentional or unintentional. All right, moving on to buyer power. What does this mean? Okay, so in a crowded market, buyer power goes up, right? Because you have options. As a buyer, as a consumer, if I only have one option, I'm pretty limited. If I want that good or that service or that product, and there's only one option to get it, they have power over me in terms of price, in terms of a lot of things, right? So that's something to think of is how competitive is the market? How crowded is the market? And what is my position in relation to the market? Right? So if you're basically just offering the same type of product with the same type of features as everyone else in a crowded market, the buyer power is high, right? There's not much that you can do to charge more or grow your user base through anything that's product driven, right? But the more you can differentiate yourself, the more the buyer power goes down, right? So for a while, Apple pretty much owned the space in a lot of ways for like MP3 players, and it's still in some of their products, they're pretty much seen as like the premier consumer product in certain segments because they differentiate their products so well, right? And so that's why they can charge a premium. And there's other factors that go into it, but largely buyer power goes down as you differentiate yourself or as you're first to market. So if you're the only player in the space, this kind of goes to a concept called blue ocean strategy. There's a great book on it, probably a lot of great articles written about it. But if you can carve out a blue ocean and make the competition irrelevant, right, then buyer power goes way down. You have the power um, as the supplier of the good or the service. Okay. So how does supplier power relate in terms of our product? Well, the way I like to think about this is some companies, some startups rely on third-party integrations for certain key functionality, right? And I said key functionality. So I've heard many startup stories where a startup failed because they were reliant on some open API from LinkedIn. They were reliant on some open integration, some partnership. And let's say that for in LinkedIn's case, they shut down the open API. They made it no longer accessible. But if your product hinged on having access to that data, you're out of luck, right? And likewise, if your business is hinged on having a partnership with another company, and they either end the partnership or they go out of business or whatever it may be, you're out of luck. And so in those scenarios, there's other organizations or other products that are supplying value to your product and therefore your users that you're relying on. So the more you rely on outside product, services, partnerships, etc., the higher their power is. So just think about that in terms of whatever situation that you're getting into of, is this company over reliant on key things that keep the business running? And this, again, this may not be something that you put into the portfolio piece, but this is just something good to think about as you become a product manager and you start working in startups or even in established companies, is how can we mitigate some of the risk of getting crushed as a business or getting this product basically shut down because we're over reliant on things that we don't control in-house. So new entrants are basically like startups, right? It could be a startup or it could be an established company that is expanding their product line. Okay, so you see the big tech companies doing this all the time, where Facebook will move into new markets or Google will move into new markets, Microsoft. And that's a big threat, right? If one of these big established organizations with a lot of resources moves in on your area, that's potentially deadly for your business. Now, there's also the understanding that some of these big businesses um, don't always launch successful products, right? Google launches way more failed products than successful ones. So it just because a major company is launching in your space doesn't mean they're going to be successful. But it is something to be aware of, right? Probably one of the more scary things is as you work in an established company, keeping your eye on the up and coming startup who's flying under the radar, because for a while they'll be irrelevant until they're relevant, and then by then it's too late because they've got that flywheel spinning and they've gotten that momentum built up. So I hope after this video you feel like you have a holistic understanding of the five forces and how it may apply to you as you become a product manager. Again, it may not be something you care to display in the portfolio. Maybe it is, but it's definitely something to remember and keep in mind as you become a product manager and start bringing new products to market. So a couple things before we go to make sure we avoid is when we're looking at competitors, we don't want to look at competitors to copy what they're doing. And there's a few reasons for this, right? One of the key reasons is we have no idea if what they're doing is actually working, right? Are they successful? I think Adobe is a great example of this, right? If anyone looked at Adobe, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I don't know when they launched Creative Cloud, but before they launched Creative Cloud, let's say, if somebody would have looked at Adobe and said, man, they're really successful, I should copy what they're doing. It would take a long time. You probably wouldn't be able to create as good of a product or as robust of a product. And then they come up with Creative Cloud, and now you're irrelevant because you're building this really robust, hard to use desktop software to try to copy Adobe. And that's not going to work, right? So there's no guarantee that something that your competitor is doing today and being successful at is going to get them to where they need to be next, right? To take that next step in the evolution of their business. The other reason is even if they launch a new feature or whatever, who knows if they did proper research, or if they're launching this feature based on faulty assumptions, or because the CEO told them that they had to do it, right? So just because a competitor does something doesn't mean it's the right decision. So don't copy competitors, especially established players. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that can go into decisions that are made. And just because the feature is there doesn't mean it's being utilized or actually creating value. So that's going to take us right into user research, because it's all about the user. It's not about our competitor. It's all about the user. Apple knows this very, very well, and that's why they don't compete. Right? You never hear about, well, at least traditionally, you never really hear about Apple competing with these other big players. They just kind of do their own thing for the most part. And that's why, because they are a very user-centric organization, um, which is how it should be, right? And if you're trying to copy competitors, all you're doing is following. You're never going to lead in the market. You're just going to follow. So the last thing is taking feedback at face value, right? So as we get into user research, as we're looking at some of the voice of the market that we went over before, I kind of mentioned this on the last video, but don't take feature requests at face value and just go build it. Always get to the underlying why. Always understand the context, right? There's this framework in product management called jobs to be done. There's a great Clay Christensen, the late Clay Christensen, wrote a book called Competing Against Luck. It explains the jobs to be done framework very well. There's a lot of articles around it. I would encourage you to go read them, read the book. And it basically, in a nutshell, it's trying to get you to understand that users don't need your product per se. They have problems that need to be solved in a particular context. And so you want to understand your user, their problems, and in their given context to build the right solutions. So just because they're asking for something, they're asking with the limited knowledge that they have available to them, and they don't know the full scope of what you could potentially offer to potentially solve their problem better than they could have ever imagined. And if you can do that, you're going to win more times than you lose. So with that, let's go over to user research, because our users are what it's all about. I'll see you there.